What can the death of one dragon matter when another rises to take its place? Septon Moon on House Targaryen, Fire and Blood, Prince to King, the ascension of Jaehaerys I. While peacemaking by the young King Jaehaerys and his regents was successful, it must not be thought that the reconciliation of the Lords brought peace to Westeros overnight. King Maegor's efforts to exterminate the poor fellows and the warriors' sons, the armed militant wing of the Faith, which at almost one stage were wiped out, in turn had set many pious men and women against House Targaryen, even more firmly than they initially were, even under the rule of Aenys. Whilst Maegor had collected the heads of hundreds of stars and swords, hundreds more remained at large, and tens of thousands of lesser lords, landed knights, and small folk sheltered them, fed them, and gave them aid and comfort wherever they could. Ragged Silas and Dennis the Lame commanded roving bands of poor fellows, who came and went like wraiths, vanishing into the greenwood whenever threatened. North of the Golden Tooth, the Red Dog of the Hills, Sir Joffrey Doggett, moved between the Westerlands and the Riverlands at will, with the support of Lady Lucinda, the pious wife of the Lord of Riverrun. Sir Joffrey, who had taken upon himself the mantle of the Grand Captain of the Warriors' Sons, had announced his intentions to restore the once proud order to its former glory, and was recruiting knights to his banner. The Faith was still a huge danger to House Targaryen and the fresh reign of Jaehaerys. The most looming of all of these was the threat in the south, where Septon Moon, the chosen High Septon of the people, and his followers camped beneath the tall walls of Oldtown, defended by Lords Oakhart and Rowan and their men. A massive hulk of a man, Moon had been blessed with a deep, thunderous voice and imposing physical presence. Though his poor fellows had proclaimed him the true High Septon, this Septon, if indeed he was such, was no picture of piety. He boasted proudly that the Seven-Pointed Star was the only book he had ever read, and many indeed began to question even that, for he had never been known to quote from the holy tome, and no man had ever seen him read nor write. Barefoot and bearded, and possessed of immense vigour, Septon Moon could speak for hours, as he often did, and when he spoke, it was about sin. "I am a sinner," were the words with which Septon Moon began every sermon, and so he was, a creature of immense appetite, a glutton and a drunken, renowned for his lechery. Moon lay each night with a different woman, impregnating so many of them that his acolytes began to say that his seed could make a barren woman fertile. Such was the ignorance and folly of his followers. This tale became widely believed. Husbands began to offer him their wives, and mothers their daughters. Every day Septon Moon went forth to denounce the sin of House Targaryen, and the lick-spittle High Septon who had permitted their abominations. Whilst inside Oldtown, the true father of the faithful had become a virtual prisoner in his own sept, unable to set forth outside the confines of it. Though Lord Hightower had closed the gates against Septon Moon and his followers, and refused to allow them entrance to his city, he showed no eagerness to take up arms against them, despite repeated pleas from the High Septon. When pressed for a reason, Lord Hightower cited a disdain for shedding pious blood, but many claimed the real reason was his unwillingness to offer battle to Lords Oakhart and Rowan, who had granted Moon their protection. His reluctance earned him the name Lord Donal the Delayer, from the maesters of the Citadel. The long conflict between King Maegor and the Faith had made it imperative that Jaehaerys be anointed by the High Septon. Lord Rogar and Queen Regent Alyssa Velaryon both agreed. But before that could happen, Septon Moon and his ragged horde must be dealt with, so Jaehaerys could travel safely to Oldtown via royal progress, rather than on his dragon. It had been hoped that the news of Maegor's death would be sufficient to persuade many of Moon's followers to disperse, and some had done just that, but no more than a handful, in a number that closed to 5,000. What can the death of one dragon matter when another rises up to take its place. Septon Moon loudly decreed, Westeros will not be clean again until all Targaryens have been slain or driven back into the sea. Every day he preached anew, calling upon Lord Hightower to deliver Oldtown to him, calling upon the High Septon to leave the Starry Sept and face the wrath of the poor fellows, the true pious he had betrayed, calling upon the small folk of the realm to rise up, and yet every night he sinned anew. Across the realm in King's Landing, Jaehaerys and his councillors considered how to rid the realm of this scourge. The boy king and his sisters, Rhaena and Alysanne, all had dragons, and some felt the best way to deal with Septon Moon was the way that Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters had dealt with two of the Lannister and Gardner kings on the field of fire. But Jaehaerys had no taste for such slaughter, and his mother, Queen Alyssa, flatly forbade it, reminding them of the fate of Rhaenys Targaryen and her dragon in Dorne. Lord Rhaegar, the Hand of the King, with some reluctance, said that he would lead his own host of Stormlanders across the Reach and disperse Moon's men by force, though this would mean pitting his Stormlanders and what other forces he might gather directly against Lord Rowan and Oakheart and their knights and men-at-arms, as well as the many poor fellows. Like as not, we will win, Rhaegar said, but not without great cost. Maybe it is possible the gods were listening to Rhaegar, for even as the king and council argued in King's Landing, the problem was resolved in the most unexpected of ways. A warm dusk was falling outside of Oldtown when Septon Moon, as usual, retired to his tent for his lavish evening meal, exhausted by a day of preaching. As always, he was guarded by his poor fellows, huge strapping axemen with unshorn beards. But when a comely young woman presented herself at the Septon's tent with a flagon of wine that she wished to give his High Holiness in return for his help, they admitted her without question. They knew what sort of help the woman required, the sort that would put a babe inside her. A short time passed, during which the men outside the tent only heard laughter from Septon Moon. But then, suddenly, there was a groan, and the woman shrieked, followed by a bellow of rage. The tent flap was thrown open, and the woman burst out half-naked and barefoot, and dashed away wide-eyed and terrified, before any of the poor fellows could think to stop her. Septon Moon himself followed moments later, naked, roaring, and drenched in blood. He was holding his neck, and blood was leaking from between his fingers and dripping down his beard from where his throat had been slit open. Westeros will not be clean again until all the Targaryens have been slain or driven back into the sea. Septon Moon on House Targaryen, Fire and Blood, Prince into King, the Ascension of Jaehaerys I. It is said that Septon Moon staggered through half the camp, lurching from campfire to campfire in pursuit of the woman who had supposedly cut his throat. Finally, even his great strength failed him. He collapsed and died as his acolytes pressed around him, wailing in their grief. Of his slayer, there was no sign. She had vanished into the night, never to be seen again. Rageful poor fellows tore the camp apart for 2 days in search of her, destroying tents, seizing dozens of women, beating any man who tried to stand in their way. But they never found their quarry. Septon Moon's own guards could not even agree on what his killer had looked like. The guards did recall the woman had brought a flagon of wine with her as a gift for the High Septon. Half the wine still remained in the flagon when the tent was searched, and 4 of the poor fellows shared it as the sun was coming up, after carrying the corpse of their prophet back to his own bed. All 4 were dead before noon. The wine had been laced with poison. In the aftermath of Septon Moon's death, the ragged host that he had led to Oldtown began to dissipate. Some of his followers had already slipped away when word of King Maegor's death and Jaehaerys' ascension reached them. Now that slow trickle became a flood. Before the Septon's corpse had even begun to stink, a dozen rivals had come forward to claim the mantle, and fights began to break out amongst different factions and followers. It may have been thought that Moon's men would turn to the 2 lords amongst them for leadership. That could not be further from the truth. The poor fellows, especially, were no respecters of nobility, and the reluctance of Lord Rowan and Oakheart to commit their knights and men-at-arms to a full-on assault of Oldtown's walls had made them wary of the two lords. The possessions of Moon's mortal remains became itself a bone of contention between two of his would-be successors, the poor fellow known as Robb the Starveling and as Lorcas the Learned, who boasted of having committed all of the seven-pointed star to memory. Lorcas claimed to have had a vision that Moon would yet deliver Oldtown into the hands of his fellows even after death. After seizing the Septon's body from Robb the Starveling, this learned fool stepped atop Desiree to storm the gates of Oldtown. Fewer than 100 men joined the foolish attack, and most of them died beneath a rain of arrows and spears before they got within 100 feet of the city walls. Those who did reach the walls were then drenched in boiling oil or set aflame with burning pitch, Lorcas the Learned himself amongst them. When all his men were dead or dying, a dozen of Lord Hightower's boldest knights sallied forth, seized Septon Moon's body, and removed his head. Tanned and stuffed it would later be presented to the true High Septon in the Starry Sept as a gift. The failed attack proved to be the last grasp of Septon Moon's crusade. Lord Rowan decamped within the hour with all of his men. Lord Oakheart followed the next day. The remainder of the host, hedge knights and poor fellows, and camp followers and tradesmen streamed away in all directions, looting and pillaging every farm, village and holdfast in their path as they went. Fewer than 400 remained of the 5,000 the Septon Moon had brought to Oldtown when Lord Donald the Delayer at last rode forth in force to slaughter the stragglers. The assassination of Septon Moon removed the last major obstacle in the ascension of Jaehaerys Targaryen to the Iron Throne, but from that day to this, debate has still raged as to who was responsible for his death. No one truly believed that the woman who attempted to poison this sinful Septon and ended up cutting his throat was acting on her own. Plainly, she was but a cat's paw. But whose? Did Jaehaerys send her forth? Or was she maybe an agent of his hand, Rhaegar Baratheon, or his mother, Queen Regent Alyssa? Some came to believe that the woman was one of the feared faceless men of Braavos, the infamous guild of sorcerer assassins. In support of this claim, they cited her sudden disappearance, the way in which she seemed to melt into the night after the murder, and the fact that Septon Moon's guards could not agree on what she looked like. More learned and wiser men, and those more familiar with the ways of the faceless men, give this theory very little credence. The very clumsiness of Moon's murder speaks against it being the pristine work of the faceless men, who take great care in making their killings appear as natural deaths. It is a point of pride for them, the very cornerstone of their art. Slitting a man's throat and leaving him to stagger into the night, screaming of murder, is beneath them. Most maesters today believe the killer was no more than a camp follower, acting at the behest of either Lord Rowan or Oakheart, or maybe even both of them. Though neither dared desert Moon whilst he lived, the swiftness in which the two lords abandoned his cause after his death, and the fact they tried not to replace them with themselves, suggests their grievance had been with Maegor, not with House Targaryen. And indeed, both men would soon return to Oldtown, penitent and obedient, to bend the knee before Jaehaerys at his coronation. With the road to Oldtown clear and safe once again, the coronation of Jaehaerys took place in the Starry Sept in the last days of the 48th year after Aegon's conquest. The High Septon, the Septon Moon had hoped to displace, anointed the young king himself, and placed his father Aenys' crown upon his head. 7 days of feasts and festivities followed, during which hundreds of lords, great and small, all came to bend their knee and swear their swords to King Jaehaerys. Amongst those in attendance were his sisters, Rhaena and Alysanne, his young nieces, Arya and Rhaella, his mother, the Queen Regent Alyssa Velaryon, the Hand of the King, Rhaegar Baratheon, Sir Giles Morrigan, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Grand Maester Bennifer, the assembled Archmaesters of the Citadel, and one man no one could have expected to have seen, Sir Joffrey Doggett, the Red Dog of the Hills, self-proclaimed Grand Captain of the outlawed warriors' sons. Doggett had arrived in the company of Lord and Lady Tully, not in chains as most might have expected, but with safe conduct bearing the king's own royal seal. Grand Maester Bennifer, after the event, wrote that the meeting between the boy king and the outlaw knight set the table for all of Jaehaerys' reign to come. When Sir Joffrey and Lady Lucinda urged him to undo his uncle Maegor's decree and reinstate the sword and the stars, Jaehaerys refused firmly. The Faith has no need of swords, he declared. They have my protection, the protection of House Targaryen and the Iron Throne. He did, however, rescind all the bounties that Maegor had promised for the heads of the warrior sons and the poor fellows. I shall not wage war against my own people, he said, but neither shall I tolerate treason and rebellion. I rose against your uncle just as you did, replied the Red Dog, defiantly. You did, Jaehaerys allowed, and you fought bravely, no man can deny. The warrior sons are no more, and your vows to them are at an end. But your service need not be. I have a place for you. And with these words, the young king shocked the court by offering Sir Joffrey Doggett a place by his side as a knight of the king's guard. A nervous hush fell then, Grand Maester Bennifer tells us, and when the Red Dog drew his longsword, there were some who feared he might be about to attack the king, but instead the knight went to one knee, bowed his head, and laid his blade at Jaehaerys' feet. It is said there were tears upon his cheek. 9 days after Jaehaerys' coronation, the king departed Oldtown for King's Landing. Most of his court travelled with him in what became a grand pageant across the Reach, but his elder sister, Rhaena, stayed with them only as far as Highgarden, where she mounted her dragon, Dreamfire, to return to Fair Isle and Lord Farman's castle above the sea, taking her leave not only of the king, but of her daughters as well. Rhaella, a novice sworn to the faith, had remained at the Starry Sept, whilst her twin sister Arya continued with her uncle, the king, to the Red Keep, where she would serve as a cupbearer and companion to the young Princess Alysanne. Yet, a curious thing befell Queen Rhaena's girls after the king's coronation. Many who knew them personally observed that others who did not know them well would not have noticed. The twins had ever been a mirror image of each other in appearance, but not in character and temperament. Whereas Rhaella was said to be a bold and willful child, and a terror to the Septors who had been given charge of her, Arya had been known as a shy, timid creature, much given to tears and fear. She is frightened of horses and dogs and boys with loud voices, men with beards and dancing, and she's terrified of dragons. Grand Maester Bennifer wrote when Arya first came to court. That was before Maegor's downfall and Jaehaerys' rise. Afterward, the girl who remained at Oldtown devoted herself to prayer and study, and never again required chastisement, whereas the girl who returned to King's Landing proved to be lively, quick-witted, and adventurous, and was soon spending half her days in the kennels, the stables, the dragon yards. Though nothing was ever proven, it is widely believed that someone, Queen Rhaena herself, or maybe perhaps her mother Queen Alyssa, had used the occasion of the king's coronation to switch the twins. If so, no one was inclined to question the deception, for until such time as Jaehaerys sired an heir, Princess Arya, or the girl who now bore her name, was heir to the Iron Throne. All reports agreed that the king's return from Oldtown to King's Landing was a triumph. Sir Joffrey Doggett rode by his side, all along the route, and all along the route they were held by cheering crowds. Here and there some poor fellows appeared, gaunt, unwashed, and with long beards and great axes, to beg for the same clemency that had been granted to the Red Dog. This Jaehaerys granted them, on the condition they agreed to journey north and join the Night's Watch at the Wall. Hundreds swore to do so, amongst them no less a personage than Robb the Starveling. Within a month of being crowned, Grand Maester Bennifer wrote, King Jaehaerys had somehow managed to reconcile the Iron Throne to the faith, and put an end to the bloodshed that troubled the reign of his uncle and his father.